Investor and business confidence in South Africa is declining to unprecedented levels. And really, urgent steps are needed to salvage and revive our country's economy. As business, we are increasingly engaging directly with government through BUSA, particularly on the energy crisis. Given the gravity of this situation, we believe the time has come to be more assertive in conveying our position. The annual Business Economic Indaba, which was hosted by BUSA in mid-January, provided us with an opportunity to engage robustly with President Cyril Ramaphosa and other government leaders on those issues that constrain our economy. Key issues include the urgency of addressing the insecurity of electricity supply and escalating costs, enabling independent power generation, addressing corruption and the state of SOEs, Eskom and Transnet in particular, controlling public spending, and urgently intervention in violent organized crime affecting the mining industry. These are issues that affect not only the mining industry, but all levels of business and society. And we cannot stress enough the urgency required to turn the situation around.
I think it is important to note that in 2019, we had the safest year on record in the South African mining industry. Nevertheless, we had 51 fatalities in the industry, which is 51 too many. We realize that. There's been a huge amount of progress from the 615 people that died in the industry in 1993. So if you look at the performance, the improvement, that's been an over 92% performance. Second critical issue that's been really afflicting us, has been a surge in crime and an unprecedented deterioration in the security situation facing the South African mining sector. We saw last year a big rise in the number of armed attacks on particularly gold plants in both Gauteng and the Northwest. And the impact of illegal mining on the sector, the impact of crime and theft on the sector in terms of not only product theft, but also the impact, for example, of the theft of cables affecting Transnet's ability to deliver railway wagons to our sidings, etc., has been big. So I think the economic impact of crime in South Africa is becoming an unprecedented issue that we need urgent action from government on, and we will be talking about that in due course. We've had several serious discussions with government, both the DMRE and the Minister of Police, and there are a number of different meetings that are taking place at the moment to address the crime issues. And I'm sure you've all seen I think there were 19 attacks last year on precious metals plant in the Gauteng and Northwest areas. We're not military installations. When you have armed intruders, 20 to 40 people carrying AK-47s, it's not fun. So we certainly are looking at, we are engaging with the police and others to make sure that we deal with this organized crime issue, because in our view it's very much an organized crime issue. And then I guess the elephant in the room, as we know, the elephant in the room is definitely Eskom and the electricity supply industry, and we're going to talk a little bit about that also. But as we talked about earlier, the fortunes of mining are very much linked to the fortunes of the South African economy. And when mining does badly, the economy does badly. And when the economy does badly, it does have an impact on mining. I think the situation we face today is an unprecedented situation from an economic perspective. It's the longest economic downturn since 1945. Our debt to GDP ratio has gone from 26% of GDP, it's now sitting at just under 60%. And by the way, South Africa's total national debt was 440 billion rand in 2008, which is what Eskom's debt is today, just to put it in perspective. The fastest growing component of our government expenditure is debt servicing costs at 14% growth planned over the medium-term budget policy period. That's double any other component of growth and national expenditure. Our growth rate has averaged 1.5% for the last decade. I think people are going to be surprised if we achieve a 0.5, maybe a 1% growth rate this year versus a population growth rate of 1.5%. So effectively South Africa is going backwards from a real GDP per capita perspective. And fixed investment is sitting at below 18% of GDP. And by the way, the average for the world including other countries, all other countries, is sitting at about 26% of GDP. So our fixed investment rates are way lower than they should be. And as we all know that, a rising tide lifts all boats. Growth is absolutely critical to this economy. If we were growing at 3%, we would be doubling the size of the economy every 15 years. If we were growing at 5%, we would double every 12 years. If we were growing at 7%, we would double every decade. At the moment, we're looking at a doubling every 70 years based on our current performance, which just doesn't address the issue. So one of our key messages today is the criticality from the business side that government takes urgent action on the economy about reinstilling confidence and getting investment to flow, because economies don't grow on promises and platitudes. Economies grow on fixed investment and real productivity growth. Those are the key drivers of growth. President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address next week needs to assure citizens and local and foreign investors that the severity of the economic crisis is fully recognized and there's a determination to act with the urgency that it demands. So we actually have three kind of like major focus areas. One is the critical necessity to have a much more austere fiscal budget. And that's going to involve a range of steps. And this is not just the Minerals Council talking, this is business as a whole. That this budget coming up to be delivered by Minister Tito Mboweni is critical from a fiscal policy perspective. The second thing is urgent action on state-owned enterprises. We've seen some progress certainly on the Eskom side, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then thirdly, this key issue about how we reignite growth in the economy. The budget that does come out in February, on the 26th of February, needs to be drastic in our view, and it needs to cut spending, because there isn't much room for raising taxes. South Africa is already a very highly taxed jurisdiction. By the way, the OECD average tax rate is below 24%. On the corporate tax side, our corporate tax rate before dividends withholding tax is sitting at 28%. We're uncompetitive from a global level. We need to be thinking about those issues. The micro and socioeconomic policy shifts addressed by the Treasury paper on the growth strategy for the country needs implementation in our view, and included in that is the reform and modernization of the network industries. I can tell you right now that the key handbrakes on investment are electricity, rail, ports, crime, and policy uncertainty, in that sort of order. And again, we're happy to address any of those issues now. The elimination of unnecessary red tape, especially for small business, the priority sectors that can, in a fairly short space, encourage growth is interesting. I mean, I've been amazed. We've had so many different discussions with government as business on the issue around tourism and e-visas, etc. I wonder how many cabinet ministers have actually gone through the actual real passport queues at OR Tambo Airport instead of going through the diplomatic lounge. Perhaps President Ramaphosa should insist that all ministers go through the actual queue where they sit in the queues as opposed to what they do at the moment. And then the industrial policy interventions should be used as incentives, not punishment, to encourage investment. The most concerning regulatory issues need resolution if investor confidence has a chance of returning. And so a very full focus on creating policy certainty, and in the mining sector having continuing consequences on previous transactions reinforced through various regulatory reform is a critical component of creating that certainty. They do say that confidence is the cheapest form of stimulus, but it's the easiest scared. So if we get the confidence right and we are able to really start encouraging much greater investment in the economy, that'll help turn the ship. In conclusion, South Africa's economic future depends on urgent action from government. We've raised the three issues around fiscal policy, around urgent action on SOEs, and on the critical issues of promoting a much faster growth rate. South Africa does at the moment stand in real risk of being downgraded by Moody's, where we'll be junk across the board, and that has huge implications for our ability to borrow externally for business as well as government. And don't be dissuaded by the argument, this is a critical issue because it does affect our ability to grow at a fast pace in terms of our borrowing costs, etc. We have made some progress in some of the areas. I mean, for example, we met with Mr. Andre de Ruyter twice within 10 days of his appointment. The previous chief executive, we met 10 months after his appointment. It just shows the seriousness within which Eskom is taking its relationship with the mining industry, considering that we do use 30% of Eskom's power, and we do provide them about 60% of their primary energy. So really strong engagement taking place, and we're looking at collaborative partnerships to solve the underlying problems on the Eskom side. But we fully recognize that Eskom are saying that they need to effectively be load shedding for 2 years at about stage 2, which for mining is a disaster. So we've had a series of very tough conversations with Minister Mantashe. Yesterday at the African Mining Ministerial, he told me about 5 times from the podium that they've accepted the fact that there will be private power for self-use in the process. He also has renamed me Frank Baxter, which I think is quite an interesting way of looking at it. But I don't mind any, so long as we're being direct on the issues. But I think the point is, from the mining industry side, I just looked at the revised numbers yesterday. We've asked all our members as to what they could bring on stream from an energy perspective. We had originally had a number of 609 megawatts of projects that were right in the pipeline. We're now looking at about 1.5 gigs of projects that mining companies that could bring on stream within the next, it's defined as 9 to 36 months, including some baseload coal, which we haven't added to that number just yet. We're going to add that in a bit later. So the point is that government have recognized that private power, particularly for self-use, is a critical component of helping to solve the crisis that we're facing from an energy perspective, because Eskom simply need time out to fix the plant that simply has been destroyed by bad quality coal from suppliers that are not Minerals Council members. So, colleagues, let me hand over to Henk. So before I do that, I think we, from the business side and from the Minerals Council side, stand ready to work and partner with government. We've had some pretty frank conversations, the frank word again. Already this month, we've had meetings with the Minister of Environment, with the President of the country. We've had meetings with Minister Mantashe and Eskom and a number of other key role players. And so it's been a very busy period, and I think the impetus towards getting various issues resolved has certainly built up some momentum. But having said that, we still remain in a crisis situation, and urgent action on all these issues is necessary.
Employment numbers actually stabilized last year. It wasn't growing, but the losses weren't that much. We were a little bit concerned about some of the announcements that were made recently that may continue the trend of job losses. Gross fixed investment improved. Now that is also a little bit contradictory. What we saw is the gross number improved, and most of it seems to have been spent on machinery and equipment. So the depreciation wasn't that high, so net investment also picked up. The worrying trend is that expansion and building of mines have been declining now for 4 or 5 years. And of course that gives you an idea of the appetite for taking on risk on the one hand, but also the expectation of profitability in the future. So if I can sum it up, the cost pressures on the one side, the instability on the commodity price side, and the uncertainty of policy have clearly made it. There's a graph in the little booklet on page 10 or something where it shows that the companies could actually not respond to the slightly better commodity prices, which is a worrying thing. There seems to have been quite a link between commodity prices moving and production actually responding. It seems as if that has become very difficult for the reasons that Roger's been saying: logistics, harbour facilities, rail facilities, and the problems with electricity.